You know about stress, right? When you think about stress, we usually think about big things, but what about microstress? The things that are so routine that we barely notice, well, at least at first. Today, we'll uncover what microstress is and how we can contain and mitigate its impact on our lives. It's a good thing for us to talk about, don't you think? Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live, or you could be with us live for future episodes on your favorite social channel. You can get all information about those future episodes so you can choose to join us and get this information earlier and interact with our guests. You can do all of that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to join us and then get all of that information moving forward. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more and get an excerpt at longdistanceteambook.com. That's longdistanceteambook.com. Now, with that, and without any further ado, let me bring in our guest. And now you can see, Karen, and let me introduce her and we will get started. Our guest today is Karen Dillon. She is an author and a former editor at the Harvard Business Review magazine. She's the co-author of 3 books with Clayton Christensen, including the New York Times bestseller, How Will You Measure Your Life? The Wall Street Journal business bestseller, Competing Against Luck, The Story of Innovation and Customer Choice, and The Prosperity Paradox, How Innovation Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. I have read 2 of the 3, highly recommended. And today, she's here because she's the co-author of her latest book, The Microstress Effect, How Little Things Pile Up and Create Big Problems and What to Do About It. That's why she's here. She's the co-author of this book with Rob Cross. And so with that, let me bring her in to say hello. Karen, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm really glad to be here today.
And as I told you before we started, Rob was a guest with me in the past from his last book, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes, everybody, as well. But I'm so glad to have you with us. When I got this book in the mail, when it was being pitched to us, I immediately knew who Rob was, and I looked at the title and I said, well, when I look through this, I'm looking for reasons to say no, because the title gave me every reason to say yes. So tell me a little bit about what led you here. What led you to doing this work and doing this book?
So it was a really good chance of collaboration with Rob and I, where our worlds sort of intersected in a really nice way. Rob, as you know, is an expert on collaboration and the social networks and how people work together. And he was doing some research on high performers that he had asked companies to identify their a selection of high performers, equal number of men and women, that he could interview for a project to see how they worked more effectively than the rest of us. And he had just started his interviews, and he identified something really interesting, which is what we'll talk about today, microstress. So early on in his interviews, he got in touch with me because he was sort of a super fan of the book I worked on with Clay, How Will You Measure Your Life, to see if I would be interested in collaborating with him. And it felt like a really perfect fit for me personally, because it sort of helps answer the question, how will you measure your life? May sound good in the abstract, but how am I supposed to do this when my life is kind of overwhelming to me? What Rob and I found in interviewing these high performers is that even the people who seem to have it all going as well as anyone could possibly have, the best of the best of the best, they were identified in world-class organizations, identified by their own companies as high performers, top performers. But as we started to do the interviews, first it would start off that, everything was sunshine and lollipops. It was going really well. Yes, they were better than the rest of us at juggling things and doing their work. But as we started to peel back a little bit of the layers, we began to realize that even these high performers were kind of holding on by a thread. They were barely holding on with all of the things that they had going on. And one thing we realized quickly was it was never seldom one big thing, what we consider to be a macro stress, illness or job loss or death in the family or serious health concern with your child, that kind of thing. But it was 1,000 little things, what we began to call micro stress. So we recognized that there was this really largely invisible form of stress that was actually cumulatively really throwing people off track. And so we began to call it microstress, and we really started to explore what is microstress and what is the toll it takes. That's the origin of the research that led to us working together on this.
Well, you sort of answered this question, but say a little bit more about it. Like, how would you define microstress? What would you add to what you've already said?
Sure,
About
sure.
what this is?
So the way we began to define it is tiny moments of stress, tiny increments of stress that occur in our everyday interactions with people that we're close to personally and professionally, that are so quick and so routine, they're baked into our days, that we literally barely notice them. They don't imprint on our frontal lobe in the same way something a bit more significant would, but who take a toll cumulatively that can be very debilitating. In these high performers, we realized, as again, we started to get further and further into the interviews, some of them really were potentially going to go off the rails. They were not doing well. They were hanging on by a thread. And it was never just any one thing. As one of the first people we interviewed started talking about it, she said, it's just life. Just life is overwhelming to her. And the consequences of that are really enormous. So they're tiny routine interactions that you have with people in your personal life and people you work with closely that just add a little toll of microstress throughout the day that adds up to it kind of overflowing.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me when I read that in the book, it says, well, it's just life, is that when we say that, we don't have any way to do anything about it. We don't have anything, like, okay, I'm sure everyone else is experiencing this too. And so it's just part of what I have to deal with. And what the book does is help us sort of give us a framework to think about it and some of those sorts of things. But one of the things that strikes me, just as we're talking about it now, Karen, is, there's a tremendous, there's a lot of research and a lot of talk about the fact that stress levels are higher than ever I guess we could say in a post-pandemic world, or we could just say in 2023 for that matter.
Right.
The stress levels are higher. To what degree do you think that micro-stresses are part of that? Or are they the big part of it? Like, how do micro-stressors play into this trend that we're more stressed than ever?
Well, I think you're right about all the things that made it worse. The pandemic definitely made it worse. And the fact that we are now routinely, all of us, connected virtually 24/7 with people at work, people at home, we're just expected to react to things all the time. And microstress is exponentially higher in those circumstances. The pandemic, I just give you a quick example. For lots of us, the boundaries between work and home became even less clear. And even our attempts to make it less stressful for people, because we recognize the stress of the pandemic, things like, let's stop having hour meetings, let's just have half-hour meetings, somehow ended up morphing into, instead of 8 one-hour meetings, which overwhelmed your day, now you might have 16 half-hour meetings that overwhelm your day. And each of those 16 meetings has takeaways and to-dos and switching costs between one meeting to the next. Right. So the way we've begun to work and the fact that we work with so many different people and we in our lives are intersect with so many different people, I think is worse than ever. So I think microstress is a more significant risk now than maybe it was 20 years ago, just because of how connected and how many incoming asks we have of us at any given time. So I think it's really very real.
So one of the things that people talk about a lot in relationship to this whole area is the B word, burnout. Mm-hmm. So what's the connection? I mean, I think we all sort of can see a connection, but what would you say about the connection between burnout and microstresses?
I think microstresses are a very significant risk factor for burnout, because if you find yourself, I mentioned reacting before, but if you find yourself almost exclusively reacting to things that are being asked of you, you open up your email box first thing in the morning, you're already behind, you're already overwhelmed by stuff you're supposed to be doing or responding to. And you find yourself going throughout the day, never being able to shape your work or think proactively about how am I going to do my best work, but you're thinking about what balls can I drop today that I will be able to get away with. I think that begins to kind of crush you. There are real physiological tolls to microstress, even though these individual things seem really small. It begins to kind of crush you, and it adds up. There's a great metaphor in the book from a neuroscientist that we talked about, which is that imagine children jumping on a bed. One child, no problem. 2 children, 3 children, you get to 10, they're still jumping on the bed, the bed's holding. But somehow that 11th kid on the bed the thing goes down and breaks. That is physiologically what's happening to us with microstress, because our body doesn't distinguish between different forms of stress. It may come in smaller increments, but it still builds up. So what happens to us is not that much different than what would happen in a big macro stress. But because we almost don't even recognize it's happening, we don't have the language to talk about it. We don't know how to solve it. We don't know how to respond to it. We know some things to do to deal with macro forms of stress, mindfulness and meditation, things that are supposed to steel us to be stronger to deal with more and more stress. But we don't really know how to say, an email that I got at 5:30 at the end of the day that ended up keeping me at work an extra 45 minutes actually literally ruined my evening. And then I didn't get to sit down with my family for dinner, or I was grumpy. We don't know how to talk about what seem to be small, inconsequential things when they're adding to a very full plate of microstress already.
Yeah, I think your point, and we said it earlier about having language for it, is a big piece of it, right? I really do. And so one of the big things that you talk about early in the book is that there are 14 kinds of microstressors you've identified, and I'm not going to ask you to give us all 14. I promise you this would not be a book report, but you put them in 3 categories, and I think that's helpful. So I'd like you to tell us about the types of microstressors in terms of the buckets that you put them in, and then maybe we can talk about each of the 3 a little bit.
Sure. I think the buckets are useful because I'll go in order of how you might be able to recognize them. And so by the time we get to the 3rd bucket, you'll see that you maybe don't even recognize it's happening, but hopefully you'll understand why it might hit home. So the first bucket are microstresses that drain our capacity to get things done. Just the small things. I just mentioned the email, getting a late in the day email, but anything that kind of just as an uncomfortable ask of us, or we find out we're misaligned with a colleague on a project that we're both, not terrible things, but we're going to have to go back and redo some work, or one of the colleagues that you're working with kind of underdelivers by like 5% on his or her part of the project, and you have to pick it up. They're just things that eventually go on your calendar, go on the sticky notes all over your computer, make your to-do list feel overwhelming from the beginning of the day. They're just little by little at work and at home, surges in responsibilities. Those things in small increments, every single one sounds completely manageable by itself. But when you have 20
and
of
they
them,
are, any individual one is.
And they are. We're perfectly capable of coping with this. And most of us, particularly the high performers in our research, got to where they are because they're good at multitasking and juggling. And so that individually, we can totally do that. It's just we have so many, and we don't recognize the consequential toll, not just for you immediately, but the secondary and tertiary consequences. Again, I mentioned you're home late for dinner. It may sound like a silly thing, but it means that you didn't sit down with your teenager who you've been a little bit worried about because he or she had grabbed food and gone to their room early. That's now a new microstress. Am I supposed to be worried about what's going on here? So microstresses that drain your capacity to get things done. We all have them. They're small. They're never caused by, bad guys, toxic relationships. They're just the way we work. It's busy and we don't communicate well sometimes, and extra stuff gets added to us. That's category number 1.
Okay. So before we go on to category number 2.
Yes.
Give us a couple of, other than going to buy the book, which, by the way, we are talking with Karen Dillon, the co-author of The Microstress Effect. And so you hope you will go get a copy of the book. But what are a couple things that we could do? Because I'm guessing that everyone who's watching or listening said, yeah, I've been there. Karen, you know my life in terms of these capacity draining items. What are a couple sort of things that we can do that might help us to minimize or mitigate these kinds of microstresses?
So a lot of it comes down to actually really having discipline about communication. Between when you're working with someone, when you're in a meeting. I mean, how common is it? It's common for me that you finish a meeting exactly or a minute before you're supposed to be in the next one. Everybody thinks they're on the same page. You kind of close out the Zoom call or you get up from the room, and you never really sort of took 5 minutes even to say, okay, so let's just be clear. Deliverables are, you're going to do this by Tuesday, right? You're going to get me a draft that I'm going to look at, and I'm going to send it on to so-and-so. Just having those kind of routine, best practices are easy and they're simple. That's going to avoid a lot of heartache. And we all have become, again, particularly high achievers, but the rest of us too. We want to be yes people. We want to be, I can do that. Sure. Put me in, coach. I'm going to do it. We take on and say yes to things without asking good questions. I'm not saying we're all in the position to Just say, no time for that, or it's not a priority for me. But you can ask the person you're working with, the person who's asked it from you, how high a priority is this? If I need to put this aside, is that important to do? Do you want me to get extra resources on this? Just ask good questions. Asking good questions is going to minimize the chance that you're either misaligned, you work on the wrong thing, you just think you're supposed to now juggle 15 things instead of 14 things. Again, you have the right to, and it's you're being a better colleague and collaborator if you just, let's just make sure we get what's happening here. Those kinds of things. And again, looking at the interactions with people, do you leave quickly? Do you stop and take a minute to think about it? Does the person have a sense of you as a human being, or are you just someone that they're asking to do something? Just having more human interactions with people in general is going to mean that you don't have so many things that just spill out all over into your capacity to get things done.
Taking an extra second to write down.
Yes.
Clarity.
And we all think we will. We all think we will, and we do not. We think we will, and then shoot, what did I say I would do?
And the other thing that I would add to that really great list, I mean, a lot of that comes down to having really clear expectations, and that requires both ways. So we as leaders may be messing that up by not taking the time in the meeting to do that, but we need to make sure that everyone is clear at the same level, because it could be about, as you said, when, could be about priority. It could also be about quality. And it's not that people don't want to deliver quality work, but I may not need a 15-page thing. I may need a 2-page thing.
Exactly.
Example, right?
Exactly.
And so I'm making this out as I got to do this, and the other person's like, that isn't what we need. We need back of the envelope calculations, not a 4-tab spreadsheet. So I think that's really, really good stuff. So the first one is capacity draining. The second bucket is
microstresses that deplete your emotional reserves. And what we mean by that is, and again, I'm going in order of most visible, the one you most easily recognize, to the ones that you might have to think about for a minute. But that, we all start off the day with a certain amount of energy and verve for the day, and just little things happen throughout the day that kind of just drain our emotional reserves, our ability to bounce back and be enthusiastic and be our best self. And one that I think is a classic one that sadly many people have is you leave the house in the morning, you're late or in a rush, and you sort of are not your best self with your kids or your spouse. You exchange curt words, and then you're already heading to work feeling a little bit, a tiny bit depleted, and it's going to get into your whole day. It's not going to, your marriage is not falling apart, your kids don't hate you, but you're just not going to feel great about the day. And those things layer on throughout the day. Again, they're always in interactions that deplete our emotional reserves, make you not be your best self at work or at home. And a really common one that your listeners will surely understand is, you don't think of it this way, but if you are responsible for managing or the well-being of other people, that's almost a all day, all the time microstress, because if you care about the people who work for you or report to you or work around you, you are going to be worried about them all the time. Are they learning quickly enough? Am I going to have to go in and coach them again on something that we've already done 3 times? Why is this going slow? Am I representing them well enough to the people above us? Am I fighting for them to get raises that fairly reflect their work? That, to me, and that's, as a longtime manager, that was a huge thing for me. Is it's not because you're a bad manager; it's almost because you care too much, and it's microstress after microstress thinking about that during the course of your day. And then another one that's very common within this category that I think most of us can relate to. We've probably all worked with people who were kind of the Chicken Little of stress. They just, everything's stressful, everything's going to go badly. They kind of spray secondhand stress out on us all. And you do actually absorb that, even if you're not independently stressed about that thing. If you're working or surrounded by someone who is kind of constantly passing on secondhand stress, you'll absorb it too. And literally, there's research that I feel your pain is a real thing. They've done research with mirror neurons in our brain that if we're in the same room with someone who is experiencing pain, our brains process it, if we care about them, our brains process it as if we're experiencing the pain too. So secondhand stress is a real thing that will deplete your emotional reserves, even if you're not particularly stressed about whatever that person's stressed about.
So how do we inoculate ourselves against that?
So that is a large part of that is going to be what we maybe talk about in a bit. One of the things we learned from the people who do this well, but having, first of all, changing some of the interactions. So if you are around someone who's a secondhand stress sprayer, maybe just having conversation. That's actually stressing me out a little bit. It's probably going to be okay. Just taking 2 minutes to kind of let them know the impact that it's having. Bonding with other colleagues to sort of get you back to an even place. It's going to be okay. Don't worry. She's always like that. Just you got to let some of that bounce off. The managing and caring about people, kinds of things you need to think about is if you are somehow enabling that yourself as a leader, you are stepping in too often to do something for someone, right? You decide that it's going to take that person 3 hours to do that. I can do it in an hour. I don't have really time to train that person again. So I'd rather just get it done. Well, if you do that, 15 times in 2 weeks, suddenly it's 15 of your hours and 0 of someone else's hours. So
And oh,
managing.
by the way, that's what's going to happen the next time. Like there's a
Correct,
difference,
because
everybody,
yes,
between empowering someone and enabling them. And one of
correct,
them
right.
will reduce your microstresses, and the others will add
We'll
to
just
them.
add exponentially. It's true because you've just now taught them that you'll step in to solve for them, as opposed to doing the little bit of extra work to coach them for success, or have them come to you with problems, or ask them to come to me first with your solution to it, and we'll discuss it together, or directing them to other resources. So you're never trying to abandon the person, but you don't necessarily personally have to solve everything for the people that you care about and you want to grow and thrive in the long run, in the medium run. Both of you will be better off if you do help them do that.
100%. Yeah, 100%. So the third bucket, if you will, we're getting more, we're getting less transparent. We're getting a
Yep.
little more vague, and we're getting a
Yep.
little deeper in this
Yep.
third bucket. So go ahead.
The last bucket are microstressors that challenge your identity. And there are various things in this category, but I'll give you examples. There are things that make you feel just a little bit not great about yourself. It's not terrible, but something that happens, an interaction that happens that somehow just is not the version of you fully want to be. And in our interviews, it ranged from these high performers who kind of put a lot of energy into chasing goals that really kind of weren't them. I don't really need to have that fabulous extra house, or I don't need to be such and such a level at work, but I do it because this is what I'm supposed to do. And people around me think these are the right goals. We had a great example of a guy we interviewed, a high performer, who turned down $500,000 promotion, a promotion that would have given him an extra $500,000 in salary and bonus, but he would have had to move. And all of his colleagues at work said, "You're crazy, dude, you're crazy. $500,000, go take the job. You can be there for 3 years and come back." But he actually was playing basketball, playing hoops with a childhood friend who'd known him forever, who's like, that's just not you. If you leave this community, you're ripping up some of the roots you've built, your family loves it here. Is it really that important to you? And it was only in that interaction in a positive way with the childhood friend that he was like, you're right, it isn't me. And he turned it down. So sort of feeling pushed to do that. It could also be in a professional sense. Again, another example from our from our research are people who maybe feel like they have to be a little more aggressive than they want to at work, being aggressive with sales goals, or being kind of more of a hard-ass manager, or trying to over promise something that they know the product or service can't fully deliver because it'll close the sale. Those are things that just make them feel not great about themselves. They're not black and white, ethical boundary things. It's just, I don't want to be a kind of slick, oily salesperson, or I don't want to have to look my customers in the eye in 2 months and say, yeah, I wasn't sure that was ever going to work. I just want to have some level of integrity. So things that somehow make you feel not great about yourself in small ways come in the form of little microstresses, little tiny challenges to that are peppered into your day, your week, your month.
In that bucket, in that third bucket. And as I said to everyone before, Karen, you guys identified 14 microstressors that you put into these three categories. We've talked about the categories, but I want to talk briefly about one of them in this last category, because I think especially for us as leaders, and you just hinted at it a little bit, but I'm going to put it on. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. I want you to talk about it a little bit more, because I think that in my work with leaders all the time, whether it's coaching them or in workshops or whatever, I find that this is an area that people have a hard time talking about, but I think that you can help them right now. It's microstress 11, which is subtle conflict. subtle conflict with personal values. And I think it's maybe in many cases more subtle than a couple that you just described. Um, Talk about that, and how do we see it? Again, I think from the start in this conversation, just putting some words around this will help us reflect and observe and identify with some of this stuff. But on this one specifically, I'd like you to dive a little deeper, if you would.
Sure, sure. I'm trying to think of some good examples from our research as well. But so I mentioned in passing, but I think it's a good example of this. Someone who had just gotten a really big promotion, and she prided herself on being kind of a genuine people person and nurturing and being a great sort of coach for the people who reported to her. But as she got higher up into this level of promotion, her boss expected her to be a little more directive and not time for everyone's personal story. You know, we are here to enrich the shareholders, and it was just a really kind of hardcore business first philosophy. And she actually wondered if she should stay in the job. She could do that, and she found herself starting to go down the path of just not getting as connected to the people who now reported to her. But then she decided, and she actually spoke to her boss about it, is I shared the goals, I share the corporate goals, but I really want to do this differently. I want to be the kind of person that works this way. I think that's what got me to where I am here. And she was able to navigate a way that was okay. We'll agree on the results we expect, get there how you need to get there. And if that doesn't happen, we'll talk. And she was able to shift the job from being one where she was feeling uncomfortable, like she had to be a cookie cutter of somebody that she wasn't. Again, nothing unethical, it was just more aggressive. But she was able to find a way to push back on that and sort of promote herself that way. This is who I want to be. But I think what happens is that we don't recognize the small ways in which this is happening. So they are subtle. And some of the demands and asks of us are subtle. Even examples in our personal life, you know, we can feel like a bad parent or a bad sibling or a bad child if we're somehow being too aggressive or pushy with the people in our lives, or we have senior care issues in families where the siblings can't agree on the right care for mom and dad, for example, and everyone loves mom and dad and everyone loves each other, but you sort of start not being your best self in those conversations. And it's because there's sort of this tension that the microstress that comes in. So I think the key here is that it's, as you say, they're not black and white ethical issues. They're small ways that we start to feel a little, you know, just a little pit in our stomach that this is not the me I want to be. Even though you can't point to anything horrendous, it just doesn't feel quite comfortable.
So we've mostly, and I chose to do this, talked about the first, I will call it the first half of the book, to really give people the ideas around what the stressors are. But as you said, the research started around what are the really high performers doing, and of course that's where you figured out, you started to identify these issues in new ways, and yet you identified a group of what you call the 10 percenters. And while we don't have time to go deep here, what are some things that we can learn from? So first of all, what do you mean by the 10 percenters? And then what are a couple of other lessons? We've sort of been trying to be practical along the way, but what would you add to all that now?
So the 10 percenters was a fun group because in this, you know, large study sample of high performers, they were all high performers and they all had tons and tons of microstress, but a subset, a really small group, the 10%, as we started calling them, just dealt with it better than the rest of us. And so we tried to learn, what do they do better? They were not as affected by it. They had as much as the rest of us, but they seemed to navigate it better. So we learned a few things. One was they were better at pushing back on things. They didn't just say yes to everything, absorb everything, complain about everything, but still do it. They were able to kind of shift that interaction, as we talked about it, just in the way that they said yes to things or said no to things, the way that they collaborated with colleagues. They were not afraid to kind of stop and say, okay, so if I do this, I'm going to need to switch my priority here. Everybody good with that? They just were better self-advocates, I think, in that instance. And the second thing they were good at is they were aware of the microstress they were causing other people. So the fact is that most of us cause as much microstress as we receive. We just don't think about it. And they were better at recognizing that stopping causing some of it would help them too, because almost always the microstress we cause kind of boomerangs back on us. You know, we talk about an employee burning out that might report to us. If you're pushing that employee in, again, microstress after microstress, not terrible ways, that employee eventually is either going to stop performing well, is going to burn out, is going to not want to work with you anymore, and that's going to affect you. So they were kind of self-aware about not trying to cause microstress. And the third thing is they were able to just rise above some of this microstress in a way that many of the rest of us couldn't. And they did this in some very specific ways. So some of the microstress that might derail you or I, like we'd come home and it would have ruined our day, or we wake up in the morning thinking about it, they were able to let go of some of it, not because they were Pollyannish, but because they had developed and put effort into developing what we call a multidimensional life. Meaning, for so many of us, and again, many of these high performers, as we go through sort of the decades of our lives get smaller. Our life becomes far more about work and family or home, and at the expense of maybe the person we were in our early 20s or in college, lots of friends and lots of activities and a sense of ourself that was beyond those two things. And those are obviously the most important things to most people, work and family, but it can make your life become very one-dimensional. And so any microstress that occurs in your family or your personal life or at work can just take on a heightened importance and can really knock you off more. And so the 10%ers were very good at finding ways and occasions to have what we call authentic connections with other people. They just built a little bit more time and energy into connecting with other people. And it's not necessarily that they have more hours in the day than the rest of us. They definitely don't. And they were, did elaborate things. They had deep tennis leagues and they ran marathons. It's that they were able to find connections with people, even in small moments. So one of the 10%ers,
they're shooting hoops, right?
While they're shooting hoops, right? Exactly. That guy. So that was connecting with his childhood friend who knew him well, and they're talking about it. And so he's physically getting some good. It's improving his physical well-being doing that, but it's improving his emotional well-being, connecting with his buddy. And there's one of the 10%ers who did this really well, said that he just worked hard at saying, I'm trying to get this language right, I think it was the diplomatic no, so that he had more time for the spontaneous, enthusiastic yes. So he tried to not say yes to too many things so that he would have time for things like, they were little things, like he wanted to, when his neighbor knocked on his door, he wanted to go help him with the flooded basement. I could do that. I can spare an hour. I could do that. There was someone who made a point of saying he just wanted to be in his yard at some point over the weekend because he would say hi to neighbors and they would connect. And it was just, I'm part of this community in some way. And even people who just found ways to stay in connection with their college friends on group chats and send jokes and things like that, that just reminds you that there's more to your life than the immediate needs of work and home. And that was really, really distinct and different in the 10%ers. They found ways to do it even in small moments.
This is really, really good stuff. And I know that I knew before we met, which was 7 or 8 minutes before we went live, that we could have a far longer conversation than we are going to be able to have. But is there any specific thing I didn't ask that you wish I would have, or is there one other thing that maybe you'd like to share before we start to wrap up?
I'm just going to share at a high level what we recommend in the book for all of us, because all of us, Rob and I both have microstressors. We all suffer from microstress. We know we can't make it all go away. That's life. We all have microstressor days. We're filled with it. But we know you can make a material difference in your life if you find a way, I call it the 2-2-2, push back onto microstresses that are systemically happening to you. So all the time, you're always coming out of meetings frustrated, or one of your colleagues is kind of always under delivering. Figure out ways to push back on 2. Just pick 2. Then pick 2 microstresses and the source that you're creating for other people, and try to make that better. Try to not do that. And then the third thing is maybe pick 2 that you're going to just decide to rise above. You know what? I'll live through this. Yes, there's some kind of weird politics going on above me. It's not directly affecting me. I'm just going to decide I'm going to rise above it and still do my best work.
Let it go.
2-2-2. Let it go.
Let
exactly.
it go. Right.
Let it go. So with small changes, you can remove some of the negatives. And we know there's years of social science research that tells us removing a negative can have up to 5 times the impact of adding a positive. So high leverage opportunity to make your life a little bit better is to remove a few negatives, remove a few of these microstresses.
By the way, that last thing could be the most important thing that anyone got here, right? Say that one more time. When we remove a negative, it can have 5 times the benefit of adding a positive.
Yes, the impact. So removing a negative is a much higher leverage opportunity than adding positives, right? Adding more things you're supposed to do to add positive to your life may feel overwhelming to people, but remove one negative and you're going to have 5 times the impact of a single positive.
This is why we all hear the phrase addition by subtraction, right? Addition by subtraction. So a couple of things, Karen, before we finish. One of the things we've sort of talked a little bit about in a way is we remove microstress by having other things and other activities in our lives. And so I'll ask the question that I really ask everybody, but I'll ask you anyway. Like, what do you do for fun? I think it's really connected today to what we're talking about, but what do you do for fun?
Well, actually, Rob and I both decided as we were working on the book that we needed to practice more of what we were preaching here because we both had let microstress kind of seep into our life. So I have actively, for the past few years, tried to, outside of my work and family, tried to really stay connected to some of my best friends from college. And that's led to hiking trips and just walking and talking. And, they start off with sort of reminding ourselves of why we're such good friends. And then the conversations arc all the way into parents' health and deaths in the family, and just wonderful renewal of that. So for me, actually hiking and walking with people I care about is a really fun way to be connected to people. It's, again, authentic connections. That's one for sure. And I love traveling. So meeting people and being with people in traveling is also wonderful.
Perfect. And I also know that you're a reader. So what's something that you've read recently or that you're reading now that you might share with us?
Really great book by Amy Gallo called Getting Along, which is a really practical book, but thought-provoking on how to work with anybody. Sometimes you don't work with people that you love, and we still have to do good work, and we can't let that get in the way. And I think it's a really practical book about thinking about having a strategy for getting along with anyone and still you coming out better for it because your work is better. You recognize you do better work. You don't let some of these microstresses derail you because maybe you're not best buds with everyone you're working with.
A fabulous book, and Amy is wonderful as well. She's also been on the podcast. We'll make sure everybody we'll put the link to the book, and we'll put the link to that episode of the podcast in the show notes. So make sure you go and check on those. And so now the question you probably most want me to ask actually is, where can we learn more about you? What do you want to tell us about the book? Anything that you want to point people to before we finish up?
You can find much more about the book under robcross.org, my co-author's webpage, or you can find more about me and karendillon.net. And I love to be connected with people on LinkedIn. So you can reach out in any of those ways.
karendillon.net, robcross.org.
Yep.
robcross.org, karendillon.net. That's what you can do. Now I have a question for all of you. The question I have for you is, now what? What are you going to do with what you just heard? Surely, I know my wife would say, don't call you Shirley. But surely you heard something here that resonated with you. And so the question is, what are you going to do with that? Maybe where you want to start is thinking about how you can remove a negative. Maybe it's thinking about what are 2 things you want to push back on? What are 2 things you want to think about that you want to rise above or let go of? Or what are maybe a couple of things that you are needing to be thinking about as a leader, and how you're creating microstresses for others? Those are just the 3 of the things we talked about at the end, but there's 100 things that we talked about along the way. Like, how do we just thinking, might you push back on any one thing? How might you be a better self-advocate for yourself? I have a long list, and I'm sure you do if you've been listening. And so rather than just having consumed this, my hope is that you take something from it and share it. I'll give you one other thing to consider, and that would be to have a conversation about this with your team. As a leader, you could say, what am I doing? In your one-on-ones with your team and a meeting with your team, what am I doing that's causing microstresses for you? There's 100 things that you may have taken from this. And I don't want to suggest the one you should do, but simply suggest that you do one. And I hope that you do. And Karen, thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure to have you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the great conversation.
And everybody, if you love this conversation, we're going to point you to a couple others that we talked about here. Make sure you go to the show notes and find the episode with Amy Gallo or the other episode I did with Rob Cross. We'll give you some other connections there. And we're here every week, so why don't you join us? So wherever you happen to have found us, we'll be there. Whatever platform that you consume your podcasts on, you can like us, you can star us, you can rate us, you can refer us. You know what that is, wherever you happen to be. And I hope that you'll tell someone else. But most of all, I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everyone.